wanted to attend PLNW. I actually saw versions of the talks, the two talks that we will see now. And these talks actually affected the way that I write papers and give talks to this day. And so our first speaker is Dreyer, and Derek is a professor at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Germany. And so Derek's work is really at the forefront of our current understanding for how to verify programs, and in particular concurrent programs. He's going to give a talk on how to write papers. His own papers are, I find, really clear and engaging, and I would really recommend them as examples for high-quality academic writing. So, welcome, Derek.
All right. Thank you very much, Mariana. Could everyone hear me okay? Yes? Good? Great. So as Mariana said, my name is Derek Dreyer. I have been a full-time independent researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Saarbrücken, Germany for the past almost 12 years. And you might think that being a full-time independent researcher means that I get to sit and do independent research full-time. But the truth is, that's not the case. Of course, a big part of my job is doing research, but ultimately, once we've done some piece of research, we have to actually communicate that to other people, and that typically, look, there's a few people walking in. Okay, good. That typically takes the form of first writing papers about it. So once we've done some piece of research to the point that we think we can actually communicate it to other people, we write a paper, we submit that to a conference like UPSLA or POPL or ICFP or PLDI. And if we're lucky enough to get that paper accepted, then we go and give a talk at the conference to present it to a big audience. And so I think for a lot of people, these two aspects of the job of being a researcher, these communication aspects are the ones they like the least. You know, there's a lot of people really just like to sit in their office or at home or wherever in their little hole and do their research, and they would be happy if that was the end of the story. But for me, this is a kind of bizarre attitude. I get the most out of these communication aspects of the job. Of course, I also like doing research, or else I would. There's other things I could do with my life. But ultimately, it's the point about communicating to other people that I find exciting. And the reason I find it exciting is because that's actually the point when the research sort of comes into view, when I really understand what the research is actually about, what the key ideas are, and that only really happens when I have this forcing function of having to write a paper or give a talk. So in this session, as Mariana said, John is going to tell you about how to give a great talk, and I'm going to start out by giving you some advice that I've collected over the years that I apply to my own work about how to write good papers. So show of hands, how many of you? Oh, there we go. How many of you have actually read any research papers lately? Okay, yeah, I figured most of you, because you're mostly, audience is mostly grad students, right? Is that right? Not entirely, but mostly. Okay. How many of you have sort of thrown up your hands in despair and dismay upon reading one of these research papers because you had no idea what was going on? Okay, it's about the same number. Indeed, welcome to my world, right? So I spend a lot of time, especially when I'm on program committees, but also when I'm doing, developing papers, and I have to do the related work sections, and I have to, really read up on the state of the art. And I often am totally confused as to what's going on in many of the papers I read. So you might think that this is just because you are still junior and you sort of lack the technical sophistication to understand what's going on. And that may be true to some extent. Obviously, once you get into a certain area, you understand the lay of the land better. But the reality is most papers, or certainly many papers, but I would say probably most papers are really pretty poorly written. So this gives you a potential opportunity, right? If you can actually do better than the norm, right? If you can actually write clear, accessible papers, then many wonderful things will happen. Okay, first, people will enjoy reading your papers, so you'll feel good about that. People will actually learn something from your papers. That's good for science. They'll get accepted to top conferences. Okay, so you'll get things like fame and impact. You'll make a lot of money, et cetera. Well, okay, maybe you won't make too much money, but nevertheless, many wonderful things will happen if you can actually figure out how to write clear papers. So I think this is something that's worth investing in, both for your own satisfaction and for your career and for science. So why is it actually so hard? I would say the main reason that writing clear papers is hard is because there's inherently this gap between the writer of a paper and the readers. Okay, the writer has been working on some gadget. Okay, this is supposed to represent some piece of research. Okay, I don't know what that is, but the writer does, the writer has been working on this for years. They're very excited about all the little bits. Okay, the reason they're writing this paper is they want to tell you about all those bits. They want to talk about the preaxial gaskets, and they got 47% reduction, not in the whole thing, but maybe in this one part over there, which they've been working on. And there's so many pieces of it that they're thrilled to tell you about. And you're over here as a reader looking at this paper, and you have no idea what they're talking about because you don't even know what this thing is for, right? So you want to first of all know, well, what is it supposed to do, and why should I care about that? And then maybe if I can understand those basic questions, then I can start getting into what is the structure of this gadget, and why are the pieces organized in a certain way, and why should I care about that 47% reduction in the latency? Okay. So this is really the key problem in writing. The writer often wants to tell things to the reader that the reader is not prepared to understand, and doesn't know that they want to understand. So the good news is there are principles that you can follow that will help you write clearer, more readable prose, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And these principles are based on having an understanding of how readers process information. So when I tell you that I'm going to talk about principles of clear writing, is there any kind of canonical text that some book that many of you might have heard of or has been recommended to you that you should read? Anyone? Yeah. I haven't actually heard that one. They say, I say. No, okay, I have not heard of that book. I'll have to look at that. Any other one? Yeah. Elements of Style. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So the Elements of Style by Strunk and White. This is this is pretty much the canonical book that many students across the world are told to look at when they want to learn how to do writing, particularly in English. I really hate this book. Okay, so there's a couple reasons why. I mean, the main one is that I find a lot of the advice somewhat vague. So some of the most famous things in this book are these sort of aphorisms like "be clear" and "omit needless words." And if I knew how to be clear and I knew which words I didn't need, then I wouldn't really need the book. So, but there's also the other problem is there's a lot of advice in the book. Some of it is okay, but some of it's just wrong and is even violated internally within the book. So there's actually a funny story. There's an article, I don't have it right here, but it was an article in the New York Times about 10 years ago where they had these room for debate columns or special articles where they ask a bunch of different people in some area, like in this case it was grammar experts or not just grammar, English style experts, what they thought of some topic. In this case, it was the birthday of Strunk and White. They asked them what they thought of Strunk and White. And usually it's room for debate, so there's a bunch of different viewpoints. In this case, all 5 of them said it's a bad book. Okay, so so you don't have to trust me. But so what can you do instead? Okay, so what instead I'm going to talk about are some principles that I believe are constructive. Okay, so it's easy to check if your text satisfies these principles, and if it doesn't, then the principles suggest ways of improving the text. It's not going to be, it's not like an algorithm to improve everything, but it will at least tell you whether you're perhaps doing something that's not clear. So that's what I'm going to focus on in this talk, and I'm going to also focus on both sort of low-level writing questions and also high-level questions about how you structure a paper. I want to say also, I have some very concrete inspirations for this talk. So I didn't just make up these principles out of nowhere. The biggest source of inspiration is this book by Joseph Williams called Style Toward Clarity and Grace. That one, although it is something, I have seen some people recommend it, but it's not nearly as popular as Strunk and White. I highly recommend you look up this book. You can find it online. There's a free PDF online if you Google for it. That book presents a number of the key ideas that I'm talking about today. Norman Ramsey has some very nice course notes on learning technical writing in 2 hours a week. I got some ideas from him. Simon Peyton-Jones has an excellent talk, which you may have seen online. If you haven't, you should Google for it, on how to write a great research paper, and I've also taken some ideas from him. And last but not least, a lot of this, the stuff I'll talk about has been developed jointly with my partner, Rose Hoverman, who's she basically teaches speaking and writing skills at the Max Planck Institute where I work. And she's been working on this material and developing it into full-blown courses for the past 10 years. Okay, so moving on with low-level writing. So the first general principle that I think is really important, probably the most important one, and the one I see violated very often and can really stop the reader dead in their tracks, is flow. So the idea of flow is that it should be clear how every sentence and paragraph in your paper relates to the adjacent ones. Okay? This is also true at a higher level. It should be clear how different sections in a paper relate to each other. But the killer problem is when sentences and paragraphs don't do this. So I'm going to show you this by giving a concrete example to see what I mean by flow. So I'm going to read you this paragraph, and I want you to see is there some point at which the thing starts to not flow. Security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game-playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. So, anyone say where? Yeah.
There's a break between the second and the third sentence.
Okay, and what was the break, or what was the problem? Do you have any idea?
That like the first 2/3 of the third sentence, you don't really know how does it relate to the previous sentence.
Right, and that's because suddenly we're talking about the game playing technique, right? So yes, indeed. What does this game playing technique have to do with what came before? Okay, and this is a very, very common problem in writing, especially in student writing. Suddenly, you know, suddenly you have things showing up, some themes showing up in the text, or even concepts which seem to come out of nowhere. And it's very, again, if you think again about this gap between the writer and the reader, it's very easy to understand why this happens. The writer knows about the gameplay technique. It's in their sort of cache. So they just naturally expect the reader also knows about it. They've just forgotten that the reader hasn't heard about this before. It doesn't know how it somehow relates to what they've done, what they talked about previously. So what can you do about this? Well, there's a very simple principle, and I apply this all the time when I'm editing students' text. Fortunately, once students understand this, then they can sort of self-correct. But the principles we call old to new, okay? And the idea is that you begin sentences with old information that creates a link to the earlier text. So this should be information that is somehow related or clearly in the same topic or theme as what's happened before. And then you end sentences with new information, and that creates a link to the text that follows. It also has the benefit that readers naturally, when they're reading a sentence, they sort of put the emphasis of the sentence. The natural way you read a sentence is you put the emphasis on the end of the sentence, and that's exactly where you want the emphasis. If you want the emphasis on the new information, so that's why it makes sense to put the new information at the end of the sentence. So this is a very easy thing to check for. Let's go back to this example, and you see that this gameplay technique was new information that appeared at the beginning of a sentence. Easy violation of old to new. Okay. So what can you do about it? Well, here's one way of fixing this text, right? So here I change it to say, okay, however, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. To make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Have proposed a new design principle called the game playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where blah, 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 blah. Okay. And so if you then go and analyze this, you can see that old to new is satisfied. You're at the beginning of each sentence. This here starts these proofs. That refers back to the beginning of the paragraph. To make it easier to manage such proofs, again, it's the beginning of the paragraph. The game playing technique has been placed in the point of emphasis at the end of this third sentence, and then this technique refers right back to it. Okay? So it's a very easy thing. You can easily just look at a paper. If you're having trouble reading a paper sometime, I encourage you to just sort of, to amuse yourself, go and try to apply old to new to this paper and see if it's being satisfied. And you'll find often it isn't. Any questions about that? Okay. So flow, again, I can't iterate enough how important this is. But flow itself is not enough. Okay? And to illustrate that, I'm going to show you another paragraph. And I want you to just tell me what you think about it, okay? Lions and tigers are some of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring species of cats. Most of these large cats, however, are currently facing extinction. A smaller cat that has been more evolutionarily successful is the house cat. Although house cats are currently the most popular pet in the world, they are in many ways antisocial. It would therefore be interesting to study whether house cats can be trained to be more sociable. Any thoughts? They don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Yeah? Yeah, well, right, exactly, because here we're talking generally about lions and tigers as a special kind of cat, but at the end we moved on to sociability of house cats. Yeah.
It was never really made explicit that lions and tigers are more sociable, or that there's some connection between lions and tigers.
I see you're taking this paragraph very seriously, which is good. That's the right attitude. Yeah, so indeed, the point here is, yeah, they don't have anything to do with each other. This paragraph is incoherent, okay? It actually has, it has great flow. So if you actually look back at the text, you'll see it perfectly satisfies the old to new principle that I described before, right? Every sentence, most of these large cats, and then talks about the house cat, and then there's the house cat. Perfect old to new. Can't be better. But totally incoherent, okay? So what do I mean by incoherence, or by coherence? So coherence means that it should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your paper relates to the big picture. It should be clear how each sentence in a paragraph relates to the point of the paragraph, and how each paragraph in a section relates to the point of the section, how each section relates to the point of the paper, okay? That's coherence, right? You sort of, as you're walking through, as you're sort of following along the paper, you shouldn't be at any point completely lost as to where you are in the big picture. So what can you do about this? Well, there's another simple principle that I follow, which I call one paragraph, one point. This is, the basic idea is just that every paragraph in your paper should have one main point. And this point should be expressed in a single point sentence in the paragraph. Now, typically, there's some leeway in where this point sentence occurs, but typically it should occur at the beginning or near the beginning of the paragraph, because that's a bit easier to follow, okay? Otherwise, you may be sort of wandering through the paragraph waiting to get to the point. That said, sometimes you can put it at the end. And I like to think of when you do put it at the beginning of the paragraph, I think of it as a kind of theorem proof model. Okay, each paragraph is like, here's the theorem of this paragraph. I mean, I think in terms of theorems and proofs because I'm a sort of PL theory guy. Okay, so here's the theorem that we're going to establish in this paragraph, and then the rest is sort of justification for that. So let's again see this in this paragraph, right? The point was you could look at any of the individual sentences, and you could see that none of them describes the point of the paragraph, right? Obviously, because there is no point to it's a bunch of unrelated sentences. So I often, with coherence, with flow, you can often do more local rearrangements to make things work. With coherence, often you have to really rethink what you're trying to say and start by thinking, what is the point? What am I trying to get across in this paragraph? So here I'm just going to rewrite this as a different paragraph that's somewhat related. There appears to be a negative correlation between the charisma of a species and its ability to survive. Lions and tigers, that's the point sentence. If you can see, that's in blue here. Lions and tigers, for instance, are among the most majestic creatures in the animal kingdom, yet they are currently facing extinction. In contrast, the house cat is evolutionarily quite successful, even though it is mostly known for stupid pet tricks. Okay? So, again, clear point sentence at the beginning, and then the rest is just sort of giving you some justification for that. Okay, any questions? Good. Yeah, you should feel free to ask during the talk. Okay. So just to remind you again, that was flow and coherence. You create sort of flow, you sort of pull the reader along with you using this old to new principle, and then you make sure that that at any point during that process, they still know where they are with one paragraph, one point. Now these are just sort of like the two greatest hits from my perspective. If you can work on these two things, you'll improve your writing drastically. There's a number of other principles as well. For time purposes, I'm just going to mention two of them that I often think about when I'm writing. One I call name your baby. So basically, the idea is that it's very common in many papers, I find, that there are concepts that people give different names, some important concepts that either go unnamed, or people might give multiple different names and use them interchangeably. And there might also be names that are used to refer to multiple different concepts interchangeably. Those are both bad. Okay, you want to, when you're writing a paper, you want to think about what are the important concepts, give those names, and make sure that they're used consistently. So there's a sort of one-to-one mapping between important concepts and names for those concepts. Just as you would do with babies. The other one is just in time. So basically, this one I find a lot in writing, especially in writing from students. Basically, people often feel when they're writing that, in order to understand concept X, they have to first explain all this background. And if they don't explain all that background, then the concept won't make any sense. And the problem is that then they often have these large background sections where they explain all this background, and then they go and explain what they're actually doing. And the problem is that the reader will forget all that background, right? The reader just only has so much in their brain at one time, and you have to pay attention to that. So the idea with just in time is that you should only give the information you absolutely need when it is needed, right? So don't just have all this, like nice to know stuff in section 2 of your paper and then only use it many sections later, okay? You should make sure that anything that's kind of a little tricky should be introduced and motivated at the point where it's needed. There's a lot of details about how you actually execute that, but I just want to make that, to mention that that's an important principle. Okay. So that's it for the low-level writing principles. I'm going to move up to the higher-level question of how you structure a research paper. And there's basically one central concept. I'm going to go into the details of how I recommend you structure a research paper. Yeah, sure.
So about just in time, what if a new piece of input depends on multiple pieces of old information?
Well, it depends. So it's a bit difficult to answer that question in the abstract. So sometimes you need to give sort of a high-level explanation of some of those old things so that you can explain the new concept. But people often give way too much detail about those level things because they think that if they don't explain all the low-level details, then people won't understand this concept that depends on them. Yeah, so that's why it's a bit difficult. There's one reason I haven't gone into it in so much detail here is it really takes so much longer to look at many examples. But in general, yeah, minimize the amount of dependencies that you explain in detail before you get to the thing you really want to talk about. So this sort of general principle with structuring a research paper is what I call top-down. Okay, so basically, when you're trying to explain something of the scale that you present in a research paper, there's a lot going on, and you can't explain it all at once. Instead, you have to sort of explain it in layers, at multiple levels of abstraction, starting at a pretty high level, actually starting at a very high level, and then sort of progressively moving more and more detailed as the paper goes on. Yeah, so that's really the general principle, and we're just going to see sort of concrete instances of this idea in the rest of the talk. So here's a structure for a paper that I often use. I don't always use this exact structure, but something like it. So there's basically 5 sections. There's the abstract, which is only 1 to 2 paragraphs. There's the introduction, which is 1 to 2 pages. By the way, I realize these page counts are somewhat outdated now. But now that many of our conferences have moved to this Packham PL style. So this is the old style where it was a 12-page, 2-column format. All right, so this was intended to add up to about 12 pages. You can double it or something if you are looking at the current page counts. So intro is like 1 to 2 pages. There's a key ideas section. I'm going to talk about that in detail. That's, again, like 2 to 3 pages. Technical meat is a big part of the paper. And then a related work at the end. Okay? So I'm going to talk about all of these sections except one of them. Any guess which one of these sections I'm going to not go into detail about? No. No. Technical meat, yes. So you might think, well, this is like half the paper. How can I not talk about this? You'll notice there's something interesting about the technical meat section. Does anyone see what that is? 5 readers. Yeah. Okay. That's slight overestimate. Basically, this is a section that only the people who really, really want to understand your work are going to care about. Doesn't mean it's not important to get it right. It doesn't mean it's not important to spend time on it. But if you're going to, everyone has finite amount of time to work on writing. I would say focus on everything else first. And so the other reason is also that it's actually very difficult to give a very general advice for technical meat. It varies so much between different topics and different subfields of programming languages. So, but I'm happy to give you further comments about that offline if you're interested. So actually, I realized also that when I've given this talk before, there's one other piece of the paper that's extremely important, and I've left off the slide. Does anyone see what that is? No. Title, yes, exactly. So the title really is, that's like whatever, 5 to 10 words and like 10,000 readers or something. So people don't like to read, is the point, right? So they'll be happy to read the title, and mostly that's it. And so actually the title is extremely important, and I would love to give you great advice about writing titles, but that actually is that's easily as hard as giving you advice on technical meat. So I'm not going to do that here. If you're interested in advice about titles, I'm happy to offer whatever advice I can come up with. But that's a very hard problem. It's also important. I mean, titles are important because. I'm not going to go into the titles anymore. I'm going to focus on the larger sections. So let's look at abstract and intro. So I'm actually talking about abstract and intro together because for me the structure of the abstract is kind of like a mini introduction, and so I think it's somewhat easier to sort of focus on that, and then I'll talk a bit about how you generalize to an intro. So I apply, again, this is thinking top down. I apply this model I call CGI, which stands for context gap innovation. The idea is the context sort of sets the stage. So it motivates the general topic about what you're working on, and lets the reader know, like, this is the baseline. Like, this is sort of the general area of programming languages, or the general topic that this paper is about. But doesn't set up exactly what your problem is. That's the point of the gap. So the gap, once you've set up the basic stage, then the gap sort of goes deeper into your specific problem, meaning the problem that you are making progress on, the specific problem you're making progress on, that previous work hasn't made progress on. And in the gap section, you should be explaining why previous work does not completely address that problem. Right? What's the thing that's missing from the state of the art? And then innovation is basically stating stating what you've done that's actually new and that addresses and how it addresses that gap. Okay. So just to illustrate this concretely again, I'm going to show you an abstract for this talk, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to read you a paragraph. Okay, but so here's basically an abstract for the talk. Learning to write well is an essential part of becoming a successful researcher. Context. Unfortunately, many researchers find it very hard to write well because they do not know how to view their text from the perspective of the reader. That's the gap. The innovation is, in this talk, we present a simple set of principles for good writing based on an understanding of how readers process information. Unlike such platitudes as be clear or omit needless words, our principles are constructive. One can easily check whether a piece of text satisfies them, and if it doesn't, the principles suggest concrete ways to improve it. You can tell I really hate Strunk and White since I brought it up in this abstract. So that gives you a flavor of it. So, and when I'm writing abstracts, I typically try to follow this kind of a structure. And this is actually even the size of an abstract, right? This is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 sentences here.
So,
yeah, good.
You said you typically follow this.
Yes.
So, meaning, are there any exceptions?
Sometimes, yeah. Well, no. That's a good question. Off the top of my head, no. It's just sometimes it's a little longer. So sometimes it may take a little bit longer than one sentence to establish the context or the gap. Maybe I do. One common thing I do is I spend if I'm writing a little bit of a longer abstract, I'll spend the first paragraph on the context and gap, and the second paragraph on the innovation. Partly because I like writing in the paper, I'd write in this paper or something as a sort of clear divider between the gap and the innovation. It's a very clear signpost that we're now talking about the innovation. So that's a nice thing to begin the second paragraph with. But if you can do it in one paragraph, then I basically will almost always do this. So one thing you'll often see in abstracts is, which always annoys me, and you'll probably go and now Google my papers and point out that there's a paper that does this. But people they'll start out the beginning of the abstract with the innovation, like we do blah 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 blah. And I really try. Certainly, since I've been thinking about this more carefully, I try not to do that because, again, this is sort of this is precisely that gap between the reader and the writer again. Like, why does the reader care about what you did until they know why you're even doing it or what the general problem is? Okay. So as far as introductions go, again, I basically follow the same structure. It's just considerably expanded. So I don't actually have that much more to say about introductions myself. That's basically how I do it. I want to mention there's an alternative approach that Simon Peyton, because in his talk on how to write a good paper, which I recommended, he recommends a somewhat different approach. which is basically eliminate the context. So he likes to sort of just jump right in with, here's a concrete problem. Okay? And in his case, he writes a lot of papers on Haskell. This often has the form of, consider the following Haskell code, and then there's some code. And then he talks about what the issue is with the code. So I think this, if you can make this work, it's great because examples are great, right? It's always nice to give concrete examples to motivate the specific problem. I try to give concrete examples in my introductions as well, if I possibly can. The problem is that I find it doesn't always work because it really depends on the audience already buying into the general problem, right? The general, knowing enough context about the general topic. So this is perfectly fine if you're writing a paper for ICFP or POPL or something like this. But if you're writing for some other conference, maybe they don't buy immediately that they care about this Haskell code, and you might need some more context for that. So this is something where you sort of need to know your audience, and for that you need to talk to an advisor and get a sort of a sense about what the community is that you're targeting, et cetera. But I just wanted to mention that's an alternative. Okay, any questions? Okay, let me move on to key ideas. So for me, the key ideas section is sort of like the heart of the paper. I mean, I spend a lot of time trying to write good introductions, but I really spend a lot of time thinking about how to make the key ideas compelling, because that's the part where you really explain what you're doing at some level of depth, but not so much depth that you will only have 5 readers. Okay. So you're trying to give a sort of something more technical about what you've done, but that should be readable by a large audience. And the key here is basically 2 things. One is use examples, use concrete examples. Think about writing a key ideas section as like if you were trying to explain your paper to someone at the whiteboard, and all you had was the marker and the whiteboard. You have a limited amount of space. So you need to sort of, you make things very concrete, show them some pictures, show them just a little bit of stuff that will enable them to understand at a high level what you're doing. You would need one, what you would need a key idea section. And I think for me, the main reasons are the following. One is that it forces you to have a takeaway message, right? So people, as I said, right, they have many papers before them. And if they're going to get anything out of your paper, it's probably not all the technical details. It's going to be some sort of intuition, some takeaway. So this forces you to have one. And oh yeah, that's actually the second point as well. Right, so many readers don't only care about that takeaway. But I think it's useful just in terms of crystallizing your ideas to force yourself to have that. And then for those who do want the technical details, having this takeaway, having this higher level understanding of what you've done is still very useful as a way of scaffolding, right? So sort of building up to the reader understanding those technical details by having this higher level intuition about how things are supposed to work. So the first several times I gave this talk, I sort of stopped right there, said, okay, so have a key idea section. And then I realized, I started looking at some of my papers, and I realized that I have a confession to make, which is that I don't always have a key idea section. And so I thought I should be honest about that and think a little bit more about maybe refining the message here. So I do feel that if you can at all make a key idea section work, you should. And I always try to do it. And some of my papers have it, and some of them don't. So why don't some of them? Well, it depends on the topic you're presenting, but sometimes it's very difficult because of sort of the structure of the contribution, or the dependencies within the contribution. So generally, I think of, again, this top-down view as kind of a breadth-first traversal of your work. So you sort of start, the intro is like the very high-level bit, then you go through the key ideas, and that's like the key mechanisms presented at a high-level intuition, and then you get into the technical meat later on, okay? That's the ideal. The problem is, what happens if some of the key ideas depend on knowing a bit more technical detail of the earlier key ideas? So for example, suppose presenting 3 depends on knowing some details of how the first key idea, number 2 here, is implemented, and et cetera, with number 4, okay? So, what do you do if this happens? So I'll give you I mean, basically the idea comes back to this top-down layered presentation idea. You just have to be a bit more refined about it. I'll just give you a little example from a paper that I had in Popl a couple years ago. So this was a paper on relaxed memory models and trying to address the out of thin air problem with the C++ memory model. And we were presenting a new semantics, okay? And so problem number one is that semantics was, although it was, we were solving various problems, it was still complicated. Okay, by the way, I've seen more complicated semantics, so it's not the most complicated, but it's pretty complicated. So you certainly can't just throw that at the reader. That's very clear. The problem was there's a lot of different things going on in this paper. There's a bunch of different, like, sort of novel mechanisms that come together to make the whole thing work. And some of them, like the fine points of them, only really come out in the full model. Okay. So what we do, how do we make it through here? Oh yeah, okay, right. That's scary. So what we did was we basically layered the presentation. So we structured the thing into a couple key ideas. We sort of thought about what was the most important key idea that could be explained at some higher level. And we had one. There was a natural one. There was this idea in this paper of what we called promises. Okay, and we thought, well, we can explain that basic idea for a pretty without too much difficulty for a smaller subset of the language. And so what we did in the first in the introduction, we had a few paragraphs about this main key idea, but this is really high level. Then section 2, instead of being sort of a key ideas that covered all the key ideas of the paper, it really just covered this main key idea, and went into detail about that main key idea for this simplified version of the semantics that you see here. So this may still not look very simple to you, but this is much simpler than the one on the previous slide. And that one we could actually explain in detail. And once we'd explained that, then we could sort of incrementally build up the complexity of the rest of the semantics one step at a time. So in the rest of the paper, we presented those other key ideas, but we did it sort of in this incremental style where we could depend on having explained the details of the first key idea when explaining the higher level bits of the new ideas. And we just did it in this kind of this incremental style. So another term that I sometimes use for this is boiling the frog. So if you ever don't boil frogs, okay? But but there's this famous metaphor about if you sort of throw a frog directly into boiling water, they jump out. Whereas if you put them in the water and then you just turn up the heat slowly, then they'll stay in there and be cooked. So I like to think of my reader as a frog that I'm boiling in this way, where you sort of you put them in this sort of nice lukewarm water of the key ideas section, and then you slowly turn up the heat as the thing goes along. It turns out, by the way, that story about boiling the frog is not true. If you throw a frog in boiling water, it jumps out. I'm sorry. If you the other way around. If you turn up the heat slowly, the frog still jumps out. Anyway, I do keep that in mind when I'm writing these things. And the outcome of this was people said the paper was extremely well written and the presentation was well motivated and understandable, which is good because that was like my main focus on this paper was getting this structuring right. One point here that people often ask about is, well, this layering sounds very nice, but doesn't that take a lot of space? And the answer is yes, it takes a lot of space. And so there's a couple things you can do about this. One is simply accept that you're not going to be able to present all your technical details in your paper, and you're going to have to move some of them to an appendix. That's sad, but that's the way it is, right? If you try to stuff all these complicated technical details into a paper and you don't have room to explain them in a properly layered way, then no one will get anything out of it. So at least people should get something out of it, and then if they want to read more details, they can read the appendix, or better yet, you write a longer journal paper that explains those details properly. Another thing is that sometimes you just have to submit to a better conference. So my experience is that many of the there's many good conferences like like Uppsala and Popl and PLDI and ICFP. These tend to have larger page limits. Then there's many other conferences. There's sort of lower tier conferences, and often these have even shorter page limits. I don't know exactly why this is the case, but I find there's this correlation. And so I feel that if you really are struggling, one way to do something about it is to just submit to a better conference. I did this actually once before. I had a paper which I wasn't exactly sure of the size of the contribution, and I thought about submitting it to one of these lower tier conferences because I thought, well, maybe I won't get into a good conference. And I just couldn't write the paper. I just couldn't get past this problem of how to layer the presentation. So I said, screw it. I'll just submit it to a better conference, like one of these SIGPlan conferences. And it got in because I had the space to explain things properly. Yes?
So somebody asked, should the main content ever be moved to the appendix?
The main content. What is so define? You don't know. It depends on what the main content is. So certainly, like the most your paper has to be somewhat self-contained, right? So certainly the statements of the main contribution should certainly be in there, and enough justification so that someone doesn't have to look at the appendix to sort of buy whether it's a good paper or not. Now this is hard sometimes. I mean, for certain theoretical topics, right? If you have a lot of proofs, and I mean, I used to do papers where we had proofs that were like 70 pages long, right? And there's much worse than that. Obviously you can't put that in the paper. You have to somehow convince the reader that it's that it works without having to read the appendix. So one solution there, I guess I could put that as a third one here, is so at least for certain kinds of things like more theoretical stuff. We now do pretty much all our proofs, almost all our proofs in a proof assistant. So then we can just say, well, we point to the proof artifact in Coq or whatever, and then people are happier to just have the paper focused on the high level intuitions. So lastly, let me just
There's also
go ahead.
a question about what you wanted to skip.
Oh, where?
So, well,
Where? Sorry, in I wanted to skip.
so,
Yeah, go ahead.
Do the reviewers read the technical meat?
It depends. So that depends on the reviewer. I mean, certainly everyone is expected to read the whole paper, but it depends. If the paper is so, I know from personal experience, if a paper is clearly so bad, if I get to sort of the first half of the paper and it's just like, okay, this is bad news, then I'm just looking for reasons to reject at that point. So I'll skim through the rest of it, but I mean, often at that point, the reason I've come to that conclusion is because I couldn't understand the first half, so I'm not going to be able to understand the second half. But in general, reviewers do read. I mean, certainly if if the paper is written in an understandable way, then I read the whole thing and try to give feedback on the whole thing. So yeah.
Maybe that's just a very efficient question.
Yeah, I mean, often I get the sense as a author that the reviewers didn't really read the technical part. But I mean, it's a best effort thing. I mean, people certainly try to. And sometimes, I mean, I've definitely gotten feedback from reviewers that clearly indicated that they read the technical part. I mean, they found bugs in my papers and all sorts of things like that. So, yeah. But so definitely as a reviewer, I'm more willing to put in the effort if I sense that the author have put in the effort. Yeah. It depends on what you mean by reproducible. Mm-hmm. Then I should be able to reproduce whatever you've done. It depends. I guess my point is this is something where it really depends on the specific topic of the paper. Most of my, I do more formal methods and more theoretical work on programming languages. There, it's a lot of proofs, a lot of verification stuff. That I do not expect to get everything from the paper. I expect that I'm going to have to look at the appendix if I really want to build on it. Or certainly if they have proof artifacts in a proof assistant, then I have to look at those.
Can you give examples of what you would put in an appendix?
Well, yeah, I mean, so, well, as I said, so usually in my case it would be things like more details of the semantics, like more formal development, right? So maybe in the paper I only give an excerpt of all the proof rules that we used, and in the appendix you see the full set of proof rules. Or maybe it's the proofs themselves go mostly into the appendix, and there's just a sketch or some high-level discussion in the paper. If it's other, for other kinds of papers, I mean, I think this space issue is somewhat of a lesser of an issue for more practical papers, which is also one reason why, for example, PLDI has a shorter page limit than POPL or ICFP, because those conferences tend to have more theoretical papers than PLDI. I think yeah, I'd have to see a specific example of the area to give you more concrete feedback about that. But that's also, I mean, this is the kind of thing where you can also ask people, like talk to people who publish in this area and see what kind of things they would expect have to be in the paper versus could be an appendix. Yeah, you never turned that on. It's okay, I'm almost done. So the last, yeah, this is like the last slide actually. So the last bit I want to talk about is related work. So I put it at the end of the first thing to note here is that I put it at the end, right? And that's, for me, that's a very important principle, is that the related work should go at the end of the paper. So not everyone agrees with this. Some people say the related work should go in like section 2. Because you can't really understand the person's contributions except in the context of related work. And my feeling is there's some truth to that. It certainly is true that when you're explaining your contribution, you have to make it clear how it's solving the gap that you've set up in the introduction in a way that previous work hasn't done. And so inevitably in your introduction, you will talk about related work. You will say something at a high level about what things previous work has not accomplished. But you don't want to get bogged down there in sort of trying to summarize all this previous work, especially because, again, if you view the point of the paper from the point of view of the reader may not even know or care about all that related work. They want to know how you did it. And then once they understand more technical details of the whole problem, then they'll be in a better place to appreciate the precise relations with related work. So I do have some brief discussion of some prior work as needed to establish the gap in the introduction, but then I put the detailed related work at the end of the paper. And at that point also, you've discussed your whole thing in detail, so now you can really get into into depth about how your work is different from related work. Yeah?
Why not just in time the related work as well?
Why not just in time the related work? You mean throughout the paper? The main reason occasionally I do that, it depends. I do that sometimes if I really need to explain some pre-existing concept just in order to explain the new thing that I'm talking about. But the main downside of that is that often as a reader, I look to the related work section to sort of it's like the sections of the paper that I read the most myself are the intro and the related work. Like I try to understand what is this paper basically about and what is the contribution, and then I go to the related work to see how are they actually claiming that their work is better in more detail. Now I don't necessarily understand the related work section at that point, but at least I want to be able to flip to a section that has all the more precise comparisons, so I can see how the writers characterize. This is a trickier point because now we're getting into like how do readers actually read a paper? Do they really read it front to back? Yeah. But by high level, I mean really high level. Like often I have a sentence or two about prior work, not even a paragraph, right? I might have just say like, or I might have a paragraph, but not a whole section, right? So here we're talking about, a related work section, I typically write like 1 to 2 pages. This is a lot of text. So that shouldn't block the flow of the reader getting to your key idea, your key contributions. That's the reason why I put it at the end.
Really, unfortunately, have to run.
Are you running out of time? Okay.
So please ask your questions in the break.
Okay. So the second and last point here is just that a lot of related work sections suffer from being laundry lists, right? So they just sort of, clearly the author thought, well, okay, I have to cite all these people. So they took that literally and they just sort of cite them right? And say like, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that, so-and-so did that. As someone who's been cited that way, I can tell you it's not like a pleasant feeling. Doesn't make me feel like the authors really thought about the relationships. What you want to show is that you've actually thought about the real comparisons, okay, and that you can actually explain in detail how your work fills the gap in a way that related work doesn't. I think one reason people often don't give those comparisons is they're afraid of offending other authors by putting down their work. You shouldn't be afraid of that. Well, you should. Obviously, you have to be polite about how you do these comparisons, but as long as you stick to the facts and you stick to precisely saying what the previous work does and how your work is different, then it's all okay. So, to summarize, right, I've talked a lot about these low-level principles of flow and coherence with old to new and one paragraph, 1 point. I briefly talked about Name Your Baby and Just in Time, and then we talked about the high-level principles of how you develop a sort of top-down narrative for your paper with the CGI model for the abstract intro, a layered presentation with the key ideas section, and the related work comparison at the end. Thank you very much, and let me know if you have any further questions in the break, and I'm happy to try to answer them. Thanks.